Let's talk about a few local restoration sites. The left picture is showing you the Douglas Family Preserve, used to be called the Wilcox property. Hendry's Beach, just on the left edge of that picture. Um, that's coastal riparian and coastal sage scrub restoration, also known as the Douglas Family Preserve. Um, Arroyo Burro Preserve is a creek part of that same preserve. The Bacar Resort had to do a mitigation. They did a pretty good job of a nice coastal sage scrub area when they built the hotel. They had to do that to mitigate for building the hotel. UCSB, as I said before, their lagoons, and now the Devereaux Slough, Santa Cruz Island, just some examples of local restorations. So the Arroyo Burro Creek that comes down out of the mesa and exits into the ocean at Hendry's Beach. You can see a before picture on the left and after on the right after the restoration a few years. So the city did a really good job of restoration there. And that's to one of the main goals in like a riparian or aquatic restoration is to, in this type of case, is to slow the water down. So we had a lot, naturally there are all kinds of wetlands along the coast in most coastal areas of the world, but around here too. Like Laguna Street is called that because it used to be a huge lagoon, inland lagoon from the ocean all the way up to Victoria Street. Um, the Bird Refuge lagoon that used to be fed by Sycamore Canyon, Sycamore Creek, which it's no longer fed by that. It used to empty into the ocean. Where Pershing Park is, used to be a big lagoon that would bust out every winter when it filled up and go into the ocean. So there's a lot of tidal flow. But the purposes of those lagoons was water would come down off the land and it would slow down and settle in these big lagoons for months, and particulates, soil would fall out. Um, Now any pollutants will have a time to be biodegraded by plants and animals in those wetlands, and so the city created um, more plant life in this Arroyo Burro estuary and slows the water down that's coming off all of people's properties on the mesa and allows it to be purified somewhat before it goes into the ocean. Um, Hendry's Beach is considered one of the dirtiest beaches of all in the Santa Barbara area because this creek problem. It's gotten a little bit better though, but that's the reason why the city focused on restoring this, because it's a really used area and beach and the water's really dirty. Wetlands restoration in the Carpentria Salt Marsh or slough. There's a lot of restoration being done there. That area was protected quite a while ago. Santa Barbara International Airport also has wetlands around it, and those are really important for migratory and non-migratory birds too. And there's been restoration work done there. Um, Also, kelp restoration has been done off the coast of Santa Barbara and the general area as well. Santa Barbara Channel Keepers has been spearheading that, and they actually have divers that go down and help with the restoration efforts. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Kind of interesting. Um, Whenever you have a restoration site, you're going to do a restoration, you need what's called a reference site, an area that's similar ecologically to what you want to restore but hasn't been damaged. So you can look at that reference site and say, oh, this is how we should restore it. This is how it should look. These are all the different species that naturally would exist on the site, and this is kind of the arrangement of those species, etc. Then you can use that as a reference to what to do in your degraded site. So this picture is showing you reference zones. Look at the red dot and the red triangle. The triangle is called Mohawk. It's a reference kelp bed that's in good condition as a reference for the restoration sites, what it should look like for those two kelp beds off of Carpinteria. So that's kind of the idea of reference versus restoration site. Why do we need to restore our kelp beds? Well, in the early 1990s, our kelp was prolific off the coast here. You can see that white fat kind of blob that's going along the coast. Where the words are, Gaviota, Naples, Elwood, etc., that's land. And then where those dotted lines are is the ocean. And that kind of thick blob along the ocean land interface are showing you where the kelp beds were in 1990. And then look at present, there's very few, there's just little spotty kelp beds left. What happened to our kelp beds between then and now? Any guesses? Well, one of the things is we had an El Nino event in 1996, right around there. Big storms took out a lot of the kelp. So that's a natural thing that kelp will build up, the kelp beds get thicker and bigger, and then big storms will rip it out and then it regrows again. But in the last couple decades, we've seen a lot more development and buildings and erosion off of the land because of the new buildings and land and infrastructure. And so you're getting a lot of sediment coming off the land into the ocean. And what it's doing is um, it's covering up the worm tubes, the feather duster worm tubes. And those are what provide recruitment surfaces for the kelp. So in other words, our kelp um, likes to grow attaching itself to worm tubes on the surface, the bottom of the ocean, just off the coast. But when we have all this development in the last 20 years and a lot more sediments being washed off the land, it covers up the worm tubes and then the kelp can't attach anymore. So our kelp beds, there's a lot of potential for kelp, but they can't attach to anything solid on the sea bottom, and so they don't grow. Here's a juvenile kelp plant growing on sand, recruiting and growing on the worm tubes. Those kelp plants try to find some kind of solid substrate, something to attach to. But if it can only attach to something on the sand, it's easily pulled off and washed away. So the Santa Barbara Channel Keepers are doing, in their restoration efforts, are doing things like inserting these um, rock columns into the seafloor as a substrate that the young kelp can attach to and grow. You're seeing one here. If you wanted to get more involved in that, contact Santa Barbara Channel Keepers. This is another somewhat local restoration project. Again, a lagoon that comes out of the mountains to the ocean and then fills up a lagoon that's got a system of dunes between the lagoon and the ocean. So as the lagoon fills up, it gets big enough in the winter that it will break through and allow tidal flow in and out and kind of cleanses that lagoon out annually before the sand builds back up. Anyone want to guess where this is? This is Malibu Lagoon, and the Malibu Creek Watershed Council decided that it wanted to restore that lagoon after they started to see a lot of dead fish and ducks, and it just was getting kind of stagnant and built in the 1980s, 1990s, just filled up with sediment and just was kind of a gross, not even really a wetland anymore and stinky. And um, so restoration was done to Malibu Lagoon and restoring its ability to hold water for periods of time, and then also reestablishing tidal flow in and out of that seasonally. There's a little more information about it here. It was also very controversial. Interesting enough, you'd think that people in Malibu would say like, yeah, clean it up, make it natural. But there had been there had been fill put into the part of the lagoon and a baseball diamond put on top of that. And certain trees had been planted that some certain people had grown up with some of these trees. And the baseball diamond and the trees had to be removed to restore the lagoon to its original healthier state. And that's what some of the locals did not like. So our restoration class was involved in growing a lot of the plants and planting them in the lagoon during the restoration. And I know they had a field trip there in the class to go down there and help plant these plants in the Malibu Lagoon area. And they had to go undercover, so they had to they had to dress like they were not restoration workers. They had to dress like local Malibu people. So because they were before that, they were getting yelled at and screamed at and rocks thrown at them for doing this restoration. So it's very interesting how people don't like change. Some careers in restoration: you have the federal government, that list of all those different federal departments that that do restoration that you could be involved in if you wanted to. State governments, private sector, consulting firms do a lot of restoration. Some examples, like after the Gulf oil spill, there was quite a few jobs for restoration related work. This particular job did not involve needing a bachelor's degree. It could just be a student trainee in restoration. And this company, Tetra Tech, is just an example of one of many environmental consulting firms. This one is international, that does restoration work too. That those skills and knowledge, if you have them and gain them in restoration, can be really lucrative to know. It's a good wanted skill. This is our restoration class going out to with plants, native plants, to plant on a rock, a small island off of Santa Cruz Island, which is really important for seabird habitat, and it had been degraded by rats. And I don't think the feral pigs were on that, but it had been degraded by rats, and maybe that was it. But a lot of the plants were gone. So the class was going to restore the plants, and they have to take the water and the plants and everything out to the rock by boat. So one of the more exciting moments in restoration ecology. This is that class on their field trip. They do at least two field trips to the Channel Islands during that class that are really fun, to work in the native plant nurseries that are out there and plant some plants in the restoration sites. This is a reference site of a coastal terrace grassland, as we'd call it. And if you recognize this, this is right by like Devereaux out in IV. And this little empty lot, it has native grasses that have been there for a long time. And this would be used as a place to gather native seed of those grasses, but also as a reference site to know if you were going to do a restoration of like the bluff, the grasslands that are native to like our mesa and out in IV. This is one place you'd go to see a little bit of, like, they're not in great condition, but they're better than anywhere else. At least there's no condos on it or apartments. The last thing I wanted to mention was about the laws that are required by restoration. Excuse me, I said that wrong. The laws that we have, federal laws that require restoration. So again, this also ties into like job security. Like, there are federal laws that require restoration to happen, meaning there's lots of jobs in restoration. Endangered Species Act of 1973 protects listed species and their habitats. So that last part, their habitats, is really important because that means that we have to restore or protect habitats of endangered species, the whole ecosystem, as well as the species itself. Clean Water Act of 1990, Section 404, deals with wetlands and wetlands protection and restoration if they're damaged. National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 provided a environmental review process. So anytime there was going to be there's going to be some type of action, like a development project, a cell phone tower, a Walmart apartment complex, that's going to impact the environment, a review has to be done. An environmental document has to be created to review the potential impacts of that action or development, and to review the impacts to biological resources specifically. Now, the CEQA is the California Environmental Quality Act. That's California's own version of the National Environmental Policy Act. So the National Environmental Policy Act deals with federal lands and things that the federal government has jurisdiction over. So if actions are going to happen on federal lands, that's where the NEPA, or National Environmental Policy Act, takes hold. But CEQA is for state lands and private lands here in California. So that's important. It affects everybody. You can't just do whatever you want on your property necessarily. If it's going to affect the environment, there often has to be an environmental review done first. Um, the next one's a mouthful: Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. Its acronym is CERCLA. It's kind of like the Superfund law, as it could also be called. That created a way to help deal with the really toxic sites we have in the United States. And they're called Superfund sites. If there's a really toxic site and it gets listed on the Superfund, the list of really toxic sites, it can be have access to these funds, the Superfund, the funds that can help clean it up. I'll give you an example of one of those in just a sec. The last law that requires restoration is Federal Land Policy Management Act of 1976. Environmental review process, kind of like NEPA and CEQA, but it has to be done for government actions on federal lands. I dealt with that a lot in the Forest Service because the Forest Service is a federal government entity and it was doing things on the federal lands, which are the forests. So we had to go through that Federal Land Policy Management Act process a lot. Let's go back to CERCLA and look at some local Superfund sites, just in case you thought Santa Barbara was all perfect and beautiful and clean and there was no problems. And of course, we wouldn't have any toxic waste sites in our city, would we? Well, not too far away is this one, which is really pretty nasty, the Casmalia Hazardous Waste Management Facility. So from 1973 to 1989, in this town, which is outside of Lompoc. Actually, let me show it to you for a second here. Santa Maria, upper right. Lompoc would be lower right. And up in the mountains, but overlooking Vandenberg and Santa Maria, is a town called Casmalia. And in 1973, this little company decided we're going to start a hazardous waste dump site. Okay, far away from people. If hazardous waste has to go somewhere, it's actually, potentially a lucrative business. So they opened it up, 252 acres, 10 miles from Santa Maria, 4 miles from the ocean. And over that time period, that 15 years, they accepted 5.6 billion pounds of toxic waste, including sludges, pesticides, solvents, acids, metals, caustic, cyanide, blah, blah, blah. Lots of gross stuff. Anyways, it had to go somewhere. And then in 1989, they shut down, facing all these regulatory enforcement actions. It got out, and it was somehow, I don't know the whole story, but they weren't storing these hazardous wastes properly. And things were leaking, and they had some of these toxins were getting into the local aquifer. So that means the water source for the people that lived in Casmalia was tainted by the toxins, and they had to shut it down. And the owners just like couldn't even clean it up. They didn't even. It would take so much money, and it's so toxic, the soil and the water in that area now, that it became a Superfund site. My friend who used to work for the county said this is just a huge cluster. There's no real way to ever clean this up, and there are people that still live there. So, yeah, again, let's not use the pesticides in the first place before we have to store them. But that's a Superfund site near here. Goleta, Old Town Brownfields. Brownfields are often like a plot of land. Maybe there was like an auto shop or something like that where it leaked a lot of oil, and or gas stations can do that too. There's one in Montecito, Superfund site that's just gasoline, the gasoline tank under I think it was a Chevron station by Vaughn's. It used to be, and it leaked into the ground, and it costs so much, millions and millions, to clean it up. Most people just kind of fence it off with chain link and just leave it there and don't do anything to it. But some federal funds are available for cleaning up designated Superfund sites. This is a local Galician saying, "I'm out of here." This place is a super fun site. Anyhow, that finishes up a very long lecture on restoration ecology. Um, Hope you got something out of it.